I'm really excited about George Latimer being our speaker today. George spoke a year ago and did a fantastic job. And as you well know, we videotape the talks, but that talk did not get videoed. Lauren Swanson is our normal guy. He could not make that meeting, so we had a substitute, and it didn't work. So I am so pleased that George could join us today again to share his wit, his wisdom, and he has a phenomenal background, as you well know. He comes out of New York, Schenectady, ended up on the St. Paul School Board. He was a mayor for over a decade, became the president of the League of Minnesota Cities, the president of the National League of Cities. He was a regent at the University of Minnesota and was the dean of the law school at Hamlin. He's just had a phenomenal leadership background, and it's so important to learn some of his leadership lessons. So on your table, there is a tremendous endorsement. If you pull out the yellow sheet, an endorsement by John Taft. Now, I read this 2 years ago about George, and John Taft at that time, like you said, 2 years he worked for George, but this was a tremendous endorsement of a proven leader. Leadership Lessons, George Latimer, and I was really moved by that piece. So then kind of promoting, I called George the other day, and who is this guy? Where does Taft live? And whenever we tracked him down, and he is here today, and he has had a phenomenal career in his own right, authored a couple books, and I for sure John, want you as a major speaker next year. Hopefully, we had to schedule that one. But I heard him speak this morning, and he talks about servant leadership, and he resonates totally with, I'm sure, where everybody around this room is at philosophically. So his background then is attached here also. So you have a little bit of a background about John. So they're going to kind of team this thing, and I don't know how they're going to do it, but
I don't either, do we?
George. So we have two chairs here, and I don't know if you want to stand, sit, or how you want to do this, but let's welcome George Latimer.
We talked about the fact that I was George's aide for 2 years. Once a mayoral aide, always a mayoral aide. I got him lunch today. You said, do you know how to do that? I said, do you know how many times I got you lunch when I worked for you? I might stumble into a serious thought during the time we have together. But I'll try to avoid it. First of all, the whole idea of optimists, I am a glandular optimist. I can't help myself. I'm an optimist. The problem is that my glands are all leaving me. And so I got to depend on something else. And then there's the mind. And intellectually, I haven't always been that way. But I'm so happy, first of all, for John Taft to be here. But if I don't salute two people here now, then I'll forget it. Jim Reagan is here with John Bennett. And Jim was the head of the American National Bank. And we had a wonderful time during those years. And Ruby Hunt created what was called a strong mayor form of government, and I was a beneficiary of that. But a strong mayor means nothing unless you have a very thoughtful, strong city council. And with us today is Dave Hosa, who was thoughtful and strong and knowledgeable and totally someone I could trust. And on the point of trust, and then I'm going to hand it over to Taft. The reason Taft was with us, first of all, there are 3,000 employees in the city of St. Paul. And I personally was dedicated to making sure we had at least one Republican employed there. Not more than that, but and Taft was a likely Republican, I thought, and I was right. The grandson of the great-grandson of a president, the grandson of a senator, but more than that, he was managing bonds for Piper Capital at the time, and I had never met him. And of all the people who I would get help from relative to issuing a bond, because after all, there are risks, John Taft always took the time to educate me about the downside possibilities, the risks that might, and I was so struck by that. And he was very, very young. What were you, 28, 20?
Yeah.
28, he was 28 at the time. And I was just struck by his integrity, the simple integrity of managing a bond issue, knowing that your company, of course, wanted the bond to be issued, and yet making sure that the city understood all of the elements. And I think that's how we finally were lucky enough, and I think Dick Broker probably played a role also. And before I hand it over to him, and I know one of you, two of you who were here a year ago told me that there was a story about Broker and I and the Dutch elm disease, the tree removal, and would I remember to tell that? And I said, well, I only have 3 stories, and that's one of them, so of course I'm gonna. So eventually, whatever the question or comment may be, it will provoke the Dutch elm story from me. That's all it takes to trigger the old stories. But I read John Taft's, I don't know if it was his first book, but I had previously read this wonderful piece, not in the newspaper, that came years later. He came visiting me at the old Protestant home I'm at there in St. Paul. When he was first elected to be the head of what do you call the Canadian?
SIFMA. Or
No.
RBC.
RBC.
Royal Bank of Canada.
Thank you. You're not working there anymore. You don't have to shout it. When he was
This was a mistake. You know, for me, this was a mistake.
He is dying to get this mic. So they interviewed him in Fortune magazine or Business Week, and it was years after he had left St. Paul, and he was appointed. And in the interview, he said the kindest things about working with me, and I was very touched by that. And therefore, when he wrote this book that we'll hear about a lot today, I bought it immediately, went to the book reading and a book signing at Common Good Books, grabbed the book, and what do you do when you grab the book? What do? You go to the index. You go to the index and look up L. What are you laughing about? That's what I do, don't you? Isn't that what you do? Anyway, so I did, and it was one page that it was there. And I went to the page, thought it was maybe be a repeat of the Fortune magazine thing, you know. And this was the line. He said, briefly, I worked in a provincial office of a city mayor, and the mayor at the time was a lisping, liberal Lebanese named Latimer. And you're going to get... Now, I read all that and I said, well, that's all true, but you think I was saying that?
No, I said a lisping, liberal, Lebanese labor lawyer.
Oh, that's right. Now you got that.
And I was very proud of the alliteration. But he called me. He said it was great, but except. And he took exception to this. Well, obviously, I think, Don, where are you? I think the nominal topic today is leadership. Good luck with that, ladies and gentlemen. But what I think about George Latimer and his leadership style is written in that article. I will tell you that I've been blessed to have been exposed to some extraordinary people in my life, but no one had, you talk about the glandular or visceral impact on me that George Latimer did. I just was a sponge when I worked for him, trying to model his behavior. And still today, he walks into a room, he owns the room. He's always had that ability. And it's not contrived, it's just authentically charismatic. And I just watched him and, absorbed and tried to incorporate into my own style many of the things that I admired in him. But to the topic today, and Don heard me speak this morning on the topic of stewardship, the title of my first book, Servant Leadership, which is the flip side of stewardship. And there is a hunger today for principled leadership in the country. I know, because I'm asked to talk about it all the time. And the article I wrote, really I would point you, there are 4 quotes in there from an article that David Brooks wrote in the New York Times called Gracious Leadership. And it was that concept of gracious leadership that made me think of George. And the notion is essentially well, let me first tell you one of the things that I remember from my mayor's office was the cartoon George had under the glass on his desk. I don't know whether you remember this, but it was a cartoon of a group of people running off into the distance. And there was a figure, very mayor-like figure, waving at them, starting to run, and they say, "There they go. I must follow them because I am their leader." And that,
I remember it well.
that was obviously a fun way to describe this notion that when you lead, you are or you should be a servant of the people you are leading. And gracious leadership, per David Brooks, as embodied by George, as I aspire, post-George, to model in my own life, is a leadership style that quiets the self in the service of others. And I just had the honor of being asked to deliver the commencement speech at the University of St. Thomas's Honors Society. And I published it in the paper, and the title of the speech was Lead in the Service of Others. Fits well with the mission and values of St. Thomas. Leading in the service of others, we so need that today at every level of society. And George called me up and said, "Would you help me with this presentation today?" I said, "I've got a conflict, I can't do it." He said, "Well, I don't mean to play to your guilt, but I have health issues, and this very well could be the last public appearance of my life." And I thought, okay, well, I doubt that's true, but it is. And this is the first time George Latimer has asked me to share the podium with him.
I'll hold it.
Friedman, I brought Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late, and it's an optimist view of the threats and opportunities ahead for us. And he closes it with a couple of very moving chapters on localism in his home of St. Louis Park. It is quite beautiful. If you had never been to St. Louis Park, you would want to be there. If you had been to St. Louis Park, naturally, you would never want to be there. Sorry, Friedman, but we have several mayors here, and that's what this Optimist Club is about. And I'm only half kidding when I talk about the optimism being more glandular than intellectual, because there are some there's fractiousness in our culture, and it's not related to one person. And I think if there is a solution for that, it is going to have to start here. It's going to start with us, with you and me and other people at the local level, where people live and work, where people can know and trust each other. As Friedman has said, it's very hard to hate someone that you get to really know and understand. Then you start really, it's an old word from the 1940s, and we don't like to use it anymore because it suggests accepting something alien to you. But I think it's a word we ought to bring back, and it's called tolerance. Accepting things that on their face don't really fit for you. On their face, you have questions about that. And it seems we have to begin with that notion. And I'm going to turn it back to him. Most of what he said in the introduction was true. I'm going to turn it back. I'll tell you, I ran into at Kowalski's, which is a market in St. Paul. It's out here too, I think. Yeah, and you too, White Bear. The police person, the sheriff, looked, really good because he had all of his uniform on, and you don't often see that. And I didn't know him, but I kind of smiled at him. And then we got chatting, and it turns out he is the sheriff, and I just hadn't met him. And we were talking about this subject, the fractiousness, that kind of issue. And I told him, I thought being a school teacher in the public schools today and being a police person are the two hardest jobs that we can possibly have to deal with a changing society, to do it wisely and well and with some sense of justice and order. And he picked it up, and I said, maybe it's my age, but I worry. I see my grandchildren and their friends, and it's wonderful, but I worry anyway. And he said that he got his PhD, and I interrupted him. I interrupt a lot. And I interrupted him, and I said, PhD? I wouldn't trust a cop who's got a PhD. What is that about? But he did. He got his PhD from St. Thomas, and I didn't mean to point at you, but you said you're something about St. Thomas. But here's what he said. A very interesting thing, and we just had a minute or two because he didn't want to spend too much time with me, I think. And but he said the thesis that I've written is that it's really a Hegelian time. Hegel, the thesis of one force and the antithesis against it, but that together could merge. And because I have a lisp, I'm going to turn it over to John. He'll tell you what that happens, because he doesn't admit it, but he was a philosophy major at Yale, I think.
Remember that. I want to ask you, be honest, have you ever read any Hegel?
No.
No. Don't.
I read St. Thomas.
Okay, all right. Well, but the thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Oh, that's good. You said
It's
it
a New
good.
York Times crossword puzzle, Dale. I want to just mention when I joined the mayor's staff, I was very young. I was totally intimidated by him. I would have a knot in my stomach. We would sit around in a big circle inside his office, and
You're overacting.
no, no acting. And your moment would come up, and you were to brief the mayor on whatever issue you had to brief him on. And I searched for months to try to find a mark or make a difference or a niche in this collection of really smart and quite eccentric people that you had staffing you at the time.
Wonderful.
But I finally found it, and I think George will agree with this, when I wrote a speech for him on the nature of community.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
No, that's
Okay,
good.
well, good.
And I'll tell you, I knew he wrote it, and I always have attributed it to him. If I've not said this once, I'm telling you I've said it 500 times, either in speeches, in lectures, or whatever. And I basically said to John, we're grappling with the notion of the community. How would you define community? Now, I'll let you amend it if I misstate it, but I've quoted him and attributed it to him properly. And what he said was so profound, even though it does sound like a banker's way of describing it. He said, community is a set of connections between people. And some of those connections are by chance and some by choice. And the ways in which those connections help to shape, govern, bless, and sometimes cripple our lives. Now, I think that's a beautiful statement. Would you like to correct it?
Not at all, thank you. And George is right, he's used it. But the reason I bring it up is that when we talk about leadership, gracious leadership, and we talk about tolerance, these are all related to the notion that, we're not individual actors in the world. We are members of communities. We are members of communities of all shapes and sizes, and I would argue and have written about the fact that today, for the first time, as Thomas Friedman has been saying for a while, the community we're part of includes a global community. We are part of a global community, and I think that's a profoundly transformative notion. And you can't argue today that an action by a private person anywhere in the world doesn't impact somebody else, somewhere else, in some way in the world. Everything we do impacts somebody else on the planet. And that notion of community, the notion that what we do matters to other people, and as members of a community, we are responsible to others in the community, that's the difference between the leadership we need and the kind of leadership, forgive me, as a Republican, for saying the kind of leadership...
Don't get political. Really, it's so tiresome. Let's not get into the present politics.
As a Republican, I'm just saying that as opposed to the kind of leadership that's all about self-aggrandizement and it's self-referential. Gracious leadership.
The only thing I'm going to say about, as a Democrat, the only thing I'm going to say about that subject is, as a Democrat and a reader of 4 newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, which has lost its soul, and the 2 local papers, I don't get the Roseville paper. No. But I am fed up to hear with the people carping after the president, almost as fed up with that as I am bothered by him. Enough already. Get on with it. If you know, we've had jerks there before. I mean, we'll survive it. It's us. It's all of us together. It's not just anyway. So we're not going to talk any more about that.
Okay, back to the point I was attempting to make. So this notion of community is incredibly important today. Can I go on a complete aside?
Oh, please.
All right, so my great-grandfather was William Howard Taft, president from 1908 to 1912. And there have been a bunch of things written about him recently. I don't know whether you've seen them. There's a new biography out. And the biographer, a guy named Jeffrey Rosen, there is a point, by the way, that connects this back to what we were just talking about. But Jeffrey Rosen wrote an article in The Atlantic at the time the book was published, the biography of William Howard Taft, the latest one, which was just a couple of months ago. The title of which, or the headline of which, was Taft, the Anti-Trump. And then George Will picked up on it and riffed on it in a column in the Washington Post, saying how to tell if you're a true conservative. Who did you vote for, Taft or Roosevelt, in the contentious election of 1912, when Roosevelt ran for, lost the Republican nomination, and then created a new party and ran as the Bull Moose Party, split the vote, and Wilson was elected. And Rosen's point and Will's point was that Taft was a radically different president than any of the modern presidents, not to get political, including the current one, when it came to his views on the powers of the presidency. He was a constitutional minimalist, and he was quoted as saying, it's not the powers the Constitution confers on the presidency that impress me, it's the limitations and restrictions it imposes. Now, how different is that from the view of the presidency that we've watched, where each president seems to try to expand their powers? But that notion, and it's not just presidents, it's leaders of all kind, the notion that as a leader you need to respect and lead within boundaries is an old school notion. And what we have now is leadership that looks at restrictions and boundaries and limitations as weakness. What do you mean? I'm going to blow up the rules and do whatever the hell I want because that's what strength is all about. No, it's not. It's not. And anyway, that's the point I was just, whatever. Over to you.
Well put, well put. While on leadership, John has mentioned personal qualities, but I think having the judgment to choose really good people with integrity and trusting them so that they know they should exercise their best judgment and that you'll be with them, and that if things haven't gone very well, we all will remember where the buck stops, and that's all right. And if you want to take corrective measures, you sit down one-on-one, privately, and you do that. And now that we're talking about me again, my comfort level has improved greatly, and I think about the people Dave will remember, John will remember, Jim Reagan will remember. I had folks like Dick Broker, and does anybody here know Dick Broker? Did any of you? Yeah. Am I overstating it when I say he was the greatest of people? Wasn't he a beautiful, beautiful man? And Steve Wellington, so many wonderful people that you really I had to trust them. And one local word on trust, and then, of course, I'll tell the Elm story, because I don't know when they're going to cut me off. And what was the first thing I was going to say before the Elm story?
One local story.
Oh, thank you. I've been on. I really literally forgot where I was headed.
Yeah, I know.
You knew. So I was on a job for about Have I bored you?
I really must say, I came here as a guest, hoping to learn something, and I wish you guys didn't be political. Thank you very much.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, it's pretty hard to take my breath away because I don't have a lot of breath. But I was in office for about 2 weeks, and it was in June or early July of 1976. I had not appointed any of the department heads. I had made it clear that I didn't know enough about city government to just come in and clear the decks, that I would operate and work that way, and we'd work it out, you know. Well, the head of public works was a man named Dan Dunford, whom I don't know if I ever met him before. Oh, I met him after I was mayor, of course, but I didn't know him before I was mayor. Anyway, Dave, do you remember this, Jose? Do you remember there were some sewers, pipes being laid on 4th and Wabasha right near City Hall, and they burst. And so there was a news article about a geyser at 4th and Wabasha because the pipes weren't laid properly. And they interviewed the public, and I read this in the paper, they interviewed the public works director, and they said, well, what happened? And he said, well, we screwed up, but we're going to fix it. And I called him up. I said, Mr. Dunford, we haven't worked much before, but that was the most wonderful response, because you've taken one mistake and made it a one-day story instead of manufacturing and covering and all of the rest, you know. And I really meant that, and I just think, I don't know why people think that when you get into politics that it's a different realm, that people are then become stupid, and if you just tell them what happened and how it happened, most people will forgive you and move on if you're straight about it, you know. Oh, the elm tree, and then I'll give it back to you. So Dick Broker, I mean, he was the mayor. He was wonderful. He had, half of him was Prussian, and every night he'd call me with his Prussian yellow sheet, and he'd ask whether I'd done all these things, which I hadn't done, or he'd tell me to stop doing something. And anyway, he went through a checklist. So he had a great mind. He was tough, and he was creative, and he and a guy named Bert Sandberg thought that when the Dutch elm disease hit us, that it was really going to be too expensive to do the traditional climbing up a tree and trimming off one the way a tree surgeon does it, and it'd be too expensive. We have to do something innovative. And so they had this plan where they would have a flatbed truck. They would chain the trunk of the tree and chain the top of the tree, and they would saw it at the bottom, and they would swing it out there and put it back on their flatbed truck, and boom, one shot and you're through. I said, yeah, really? So we were going to have the first Horton Park in St. Paul, not far from Hamlin University. And our first thing, and they said we're going to do it, and I had heard that there'd be cameras there, so I raced to, the scene to be an on-the-job mayor, you know, and the truck owner, whom I won't name, who was named Bolander, and was built the way a truck ought to, large. Everybody seemed bigger than me, and Bert Sandberg was big, and I was there in broker, and I was watching him wrap it up, and coming from Schenectady and everything, I was not used to the woods, and I said, well, is there any risk of that getting lost and not controlling it? Not a problem, little man. The very first tree. I mean, you're telling me there's not a just God? The very first tree, swung it out, and cut it and swung it out, and on the way back, it went a little wayward. And on the way back, it hit the chimney on the first house and trimmed that chimney like a hot knife through butter right off. And on the way back, the house had this little bit of porch with, maybe 3 feet and columns, a couple little columns. Swept that porch right out of there. And I looked in there, and there were 2 little old people about my age. And the man was looking out the picture window, and I was scared, and I was afraid for him, so I ran in, and he opened the door, and I said, "Are you all right?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "That was really something, wasn't it, Mayor?"
What is that connected with? Is that relevant to anything? No. I don't. Are you up for another story?
Sure.
Do you remember the time the nuns distributed pamphlets in City Hall?
I do.
So I'll set it up. And the city attorney, Ed Starr, came in. Emergency meeting. This was serious. We were in violation of all sorts of federal and state statutes. Were we to continue to allow the nuns, which parish were they from?
Oh, no, they're Little Sisters of the Poor. Little Sisters of the Poor.
All right.
They itinerant and...
Okay, so they're in City Hall handing out leaflets in violation of church state. And
You're throwing a story out.
yeah, I know. This is why I quit. The fact that Rudy Perpich beat you
To a pulp.
And I had lent the campaign money and worked without a salary for 6 months, had nothing to do with it. But it was the way you treated me. I've questioned your graciousness as a leader from time to time. Anyway, so I'm setting it up. So what happened, George? Can you tell the story in your inimitable way?
Happy to. It was Dick Manning, who was the manager of the buildings, and not Ed Starr, who told me, "Mayor, I told you we're going to have a no soliciting rule in all of our buildings." I said, "Right." And he said, "Well, the nun is over there asking for money." And of course, the nun was Sister Louise, who, when she used to walk into the Commerce Building back when I was practicing law, you didn't say, "Hello, sister," you just reached into your pocket because you knew she wasn't coming to bless you, she was coming for money. And so, so I reached, and I said, "Well, you can leave the sign up, but that doesn't pertain to Sister Louise. She, that's where the wall between church and state dissolved." And anyway, it was funny where it happened.
You're screwing it up now. So George says something about that, and Ed Starr says, "Well, we're going to get sued, and there are going to be terrible headlines."
That's right.
And you go, "No," he said, "I'm not that lucky."
That's right.
Finish it.
Yeah, I'd love to be sued by whoever against Latimer and the Little Sisters of the Poor. I like that headline.
And you say politics isn't different. And I then realized, okay, that's the, all right. Don, should we open it up for questions?
That's fine, right.
So anybody want to?
You still have that little knot in your stomach?
When I'm with George? George has softened over the years. And I think the way I feel about him is in the article. I went to visit him at the Episcopal homes where he lives, and it took us 45 minutes to get from the dining room to the elevator because he was still mayor right there in the homes. People love him. How can you not love this man? Yes.
This is just a recollection from some years ago. I was downtown St. Paul. I was there for the St. Patrick's Day parade, and Mr. Mayor came by in his car, and I shouted from the sideline, "Run for Senate!" And he turned, looked at me without a beat, and he says, "Anything to get me out of town."
George or John, do either of you know about this Better Angels program that Bill Doherty has been doing, getting the Reds and the Blues to sit down, talk to each other with a civil manner? Do you know about that? Do you know other initiatives? What do you think of it?
Yes, I read about it, but I don't know anything about it other than it sounds like a great idea. And he's younger than I am. He ought to be right on top of it. Are you right on top of that?
No.
He's not right on top of that either. But it really does. It really does sound. And I believe the sheriff or the person wearing the sheriff's costume was correct. I still, you can't meet people day in and day out who are kind and honest, not perfect, and think that a whole country of us can't pull it together. And I believe we will. But it does take that kind of local leadership by Doherty and you and others. Just don't call me to any more meetings.
There was an article by Tom Horner in the Sunday paper on the opinion pages, in which he was decrying the divisiveness and saying what we need to have is campaign finance reform, ranked voting, and changing the way we do redistricting. And I wonder what you think about those notions.
Yeah, I read the article and have a high regard for Tom Horner. I endorsed IRV, instant recount voting, for the reasons that he gave, that it would reduce the fractiousness of the campaigning and give more people an opportunity. I have to have more experience with it. I'm not sure I see the curative power that he attributes to it in that column, although I supported IRV. The redistricting is terribly important, and it will continue to go on unless we have a system that neutralizes it and lifts the drafting, map drawing to a, and we've had examples of judicial screening committees as an example. The other day, I was with Don Alsop, who was a federal judge, and I had very little work in the federal court, but among many lawyers I knew told me that all through the 80s and 90s and now the federal district court in Minneapolis was solid and good judges, and half of them were appointed by President Reagan, some others, but the point is they went through a screening process. And so I have a trust in the profession's ability to do that. So I think there's that benefit. And gerrymandering can be avoided through that. I think that's a more powerful need for change than IRV.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. You talked about servant leadership and others. Can you give us one of your personal experiences
Well, I told the story this morning. During the financial crisis, I was running a firm that had $300 billion of people's money, and those not in the financial services industry don't realize possibly how close we came to a complete meltdown. We were hours or days away. And one of the things that every day you walked in, people were freaking out, clients were freaking out, the advisors who worked for me, several thousand were freaking out. And there was a new problem every day. Some part of the market stopped functioning. So the one that happened to me that was the most intense was a money market fund where we had thousands of clients with their money in what they thought were liquid shares of a money market fund that could be redeemed for cash the next day. The fund broke the buck, meaning it owned a security where if the fund had been fairly valued, people would not get $1 back for every dollar that they put into the fund. And that is like a bank saying we can't honor your request for cash. So the trustees locked the doors of the fund metaphorically and said nobody can redeem. Well, that means people didn't have money for college tuition or money for, and so I remember just spiraling, and at the very, I thought, I just need to get my act together. I'm abbreviating the story. I need to find some solid ground to stand on. So this was in the fall of 2008, and I finally did. I felt my feet planted and had this absolute conviction around a sense that in this moment, I don't matter. My problems don't matter. My purpose here and now and going forward is to help other people get through this problem. And it was a moment where I connected glandularly, viscerally, not just intellectually, with this notion of servant leadership. In other words, that was my purpose, was to help others. And it's a matter, obviously I don't feel that hour by hour, day by day, but how do you keep that sense that you as a leader are here to serve others? You are a member of community and you have a responsibility to others. That to me is what stewardship is all about, and servant leadership. And one of the things I always admired about George throughout his time as mayor is he was a true steward of the city of St. Paul. He loved it as much as life itself, and every decision he made was through the lens of, is this going to be good in the long term for the city I love? He was a steward mayor.
You really know how to wrap it up, don't you? What a great way to end.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, John. I'm so glad you came. I really am glad.
Thank you. It was great. Let me give you the book.
Well, thank you, George and John, for a very inspirational and highly informative presentation with a lot of humor involved. Now, I was with John this morning. We gave him a book, one of our books, but George, there's a book for you. Thank you for, again, being a wonderful, wonderful presenter and friend. And we usually end up our meetings with saying the Optimist Creed. So why don't we stand and kind of recite the creed here, if we would.